HalfStack Online. I'm Chris, and I wished I could be with you in a proper HalfStack, but we can't right now, can we? I hope you're safe, I hope you're secure, I hope your loved ones are safe, and I hope you're actually doing the right thing and keeping other people safe around you as well. Keep in contact. We're all feeling rather lonely right now, and it's important to actually hear some encouraging words from time to time. Because we're in essence spending a lot of time at home, and we do things that we normally don't, like spick and span. Everything is clean because you don't have anything else to do. You can't go out. And I started getting off the deep end a bit. For example, one of the things that I did to keep myself busy was cataloging all my clothing and putting them in a spreadsheet, which I found a great idea at the moment. But when I talk to people about that, then they're just shaking their head and looking at me in a weird manner, and I stopped talking to people about it. So I thought, okay, clothes maybe wasn't an overkill, but how about technology? We all have this big box of cables and connectors, right? Somewhere in the basement or somewhere on top of the wardrobe. And I did that as well. I looked through all the cables that I had, and I started categorizing them into different things that I needed and things that I don't need anymore. And I realized I have a lot of stuff that I never needed and I never used, and I still bought new things all the time. And this is kind of like what made me think about what do I do for my job right now. I work as a principal program manager on developer tools in the browser. And the developer tools in the browser have been growing quite wild over the last few years, and we put more and more things in, more and more use cases that people wanted to have in there. And the fun thing is you cannot ever take anything out any longer. So for somebody coming into development, or somebody like me who's been doing it for so long that I'm kind of stuck in my ways, these can become quite daunting and quite a lot of things I can't find. One of the things, for example, we're getting all the time is a question if we have pretty print in the editor, and we do. These little curly braces on the bottom there actually turn a minified code into a pretty printed code. People didn't find it, so we put this little toolbar up there, like say, pretty print this minified file, and do you want more or never show again? So this is the kind of feedback that I want more to happen, and I want these things to become not this daunting, like only for experts tool. I want tools to allow you to become an expert by using them, but not having to be an expert to use them in the first place. So I'm part of the Developer Tools Edge team. There's also Erica, there's Zohar, there's Rachel, and there's Brendan. And these are all my colleagues in America. I'm just happy there because I fly there from time to time. I needed coffee. I haven't seen them in a while now, and the time difference is quite fun. But we're all on Twitter. We're all available for you if you have any questions about developer tools and you want to learn more about them. Because I find there is kind of a demands gap. There's a lot of stuff in developer tools that people don't know about that help you in very clever ways. And at the same time, we keep demanding things. Every time a new technology, a half-baked technology is there, why don't developer tools allow me to make that easier? And you're like, we don't even know if that technology is going to go away or if it's going to stay for a while. We don't know yet. There's always this assumption that you can actually build code, ship it, and it becomes a success immediately. And that's just a very, very strange way of thinking about it. If you think about software in a space of like Microsoft or Google or other places, you cannot work that way because it's just flawed from the very beginning. We have a much more differentiated approach to writing software, which is a circular way, actually. So you research who needs that. We design it then to make it as easy as possible, and then we start developing it. Then we deploy it, and then we monitor it and see where people get stuck. What can we do better? What is not easy? Where do people fall off? And with that, we go back to development and so on and so forth. And that, of course, is not as fast as like build it, ship it, be success. It's actually quite slow, but it makes sense. It needs to be like that. Because if we look at right now at the developer tools, what people use today is a minuscule amount of what developer tools can do. Most of the time, it's just the styles editor, and that's about it. Network editor is the next one that actually is in usage on the highest level. Some of the really, really cool in-depth tools that we've been seeing conference talks about, I don't see them in much use, only with like experts for experts, and all of you could benefit from them, but probably they're too hard to understand. That's why you don't yet. So things in the developer space, web developer space are slower than in a native space because we need to think about security, privacy, performance, maintainability, ownership, and backwards compatibility in everything we do. The web is constantly under attack, and anything that we could put in there could actually be disastrous for your data, disastrous for the health of your computer as well. So we got to make sure that all these things are done before we ship something, and that's why web standards don't happen fast overnight either. We cannot do a like, let's try it and then take it away again. That's just not the way you actually talk to developers out there. Instead, we think about use cases. We ask for use cases. We do surveys. We go to conferences and ask you about things. And then we get feedback in there, and then we turn that into scenarios where we say, like, developers want, for example, better tooling for visualizing editing fonts. Developers want to view DevTools in high contrast mode, and so on and so forth. So that way we determine what we're going to build next based on feedback from real users. So that way we have the usage already built in rather than just like inventing something and hoping people love it. But if we look at the usage gap right now, I did that for myself. I realized, like, when I build something, I've been doing that for 20 years now, and I keep doing it the same way. But there's so many cool things in developer tools that fell through the cracks that I just didn't realize, and I want to show you some of them right now. Some of them might be available to you, you already know them about, but these are all based on feedback from end users that we keep getting asked, like, what's going on there, how is that working? So here's a few things that you might not have found yet, but they're amazing if you think about them. Well, first thing is, people always go like, okay, let's test. Developer tools are there for debugging, for testing some things out, for trying out if something has loaded or the performance is, and so on and so forth. But if you look at that in detail, what you're having here is a full IDE, a full editor inside the browser. You have your file system on the left-hand side. You have your scope and call stacks and threads and everything going on the right-hand side. And it's a full editor that allows you to set up your development environment in it, your local development environment as a workspace, and also have things like snippets, overrides, and content scripts, something I haven't done myself yet. I remember using like a Grease Monkey for that, but you can do that right now in developer tools as well without having to rely on an add-on that might go away in the future. So as we have this really cool environment in there, I gave myself the challenge to actually go away from console log. Console log is a very simple way of doing things. It's a very easy way, it's a fast way, but it's also a very inefficient way because it doesn't do the things that we want it to do. It's just basically a print command on a current state of something. So the amount of time when I write a console log and I have to write another one and another one and another one to really get the information that I was looking for, I realized this is actually just simulating a stack. This is simulating a debugging experience. So breakpoints are so much better than console log. You can set them in the editor or in the browser, and you can set them in the text editor as well. And they are much more work up front than console log. I know that they feel weird. Like the first time you use them, it's like, why do I do this? But it's actually worth it because they do a few things that console log doesn't do. Your code execution is paused. Errors can't slip through. Often I've got a console log and I make a mistake in my code and I actually want that information. I click on something, the error happens, the page reloads, all my content that I entered in the form was gone, and the console log message is gone as well. I can't even get to it anymore. With a breakpoint, the code execution is paused, so that will never happen. You also get an end-to-end picture of what is happening. So instead of having to write 3 console logs with different variables to print out, you can just look at the stack and see the variables and their state there. And you're not likely to litter the web with console messages that nobody needs because there's far too many of them out there already. So I did the thing that everybody does. I wrote a little to-do list app, and then I started debugging it. And I started setting my breakpoints like a good developer that I am. And then I realized, like, wait a second, there is something that I found that I didn't know before, and that's DOM breakpoints. So instead of going from the code and setting your breakpoints in there, you can interact with your application and set breakpoints in the interaction where you get stuck and where you wonder what's going on. So if you've got your app open, you can use the inspect shortcut. And then you see not only the HTML element, but also the accessibility of it, its dimensions and what's going on there. But you also have this little ... menu next to the LI, and that's something that I always missed. But if you click it, there's a lot of cool stuff in there. There's adding an attribute, edit as HTML. You can also hide the element, and you can break on it. So you can say, like, on subtree modification, attribute modification, or node removal, please set a breakpoint. So that means if something in the element itself changes, make it, or if an attribute of it changes, or if the node itself gets removed. In my case, I set a breakpoint on node removal. When I now click the X, I don't get it immediately going away and hopefully my console log tells me something, but I jump into my code and I can step through it and see what is going on every step on the way. And this one allows me to actually just follow my code and realize, oh, that actually is a mistake. And if a mistake happens, I can also stop it from executing the rest. So I never have that problem that my entries are going away. I can just basically not click the X any longer, kind of thing. There's also no need for a mouse. I don't like mice. I just basically use my trackpad for everything, and I'm bad with my trackpad, so I like keyboard shortcuts. And you got keyboard shortcuts for everything. So if you get used to step debugging, then this will become second nature, and you don't have to worry about it at all anymore. But of course, not everybody goes into that like cool keyboard space. We want more visual tooling as well. What I didn't know, or what I knew but I completely forgot about, for example, was animation editor that's inside the developer tools. So if you want to see your animations and you want to fiddle around with the numbers with a slider rather than just changing the code all the time, you can do that directly and live in the browser right now. You also have a 3D view that gives you either the depth of the DOM of your document or the Z-index. And the Z-index is something that we found people making mistakes all the time. You find these like 10,000, 20,000 Z-index instead of 1, 2, 3 because people are not sure. They just want to make sure that something covers something. And it's not good for performance for a lot overusing it. And you have to think about what you're doing there. I, for example, had another app that I wrote for myself, and I found out that this is happening here. I don't use Z-index anywhere in the app, but I actually have a list element, a list with every list element having a display relative and a transition inside it, and that's what creating all these new stacking contexts, and that's why my application was rather slow. I could have done that with the performance tooling as well, but this was a very simple way to realize that I've done something very weird here, and I actually debugged it simpler that way, got rid of the transition, and out of a sudden everything was much better. They are easy to miss extra features because the interface is so small. We don't have much space in developer tools because we don't know if it's going to be full screen or if they're going to be right or left. So for example, when you have a normal selector in your CSS and you roll over it, guess what? There's another ... menu in the right bottom corner. I couldn't do a screenshot of it. But if you click on it, then you actually see that there is editors for colors and for drop shadows. Also the two squares next to the box shadow is something that triggers that as well. The color picker is a graphical color picker that automatically gives you all the colors that are actually used in your CSS, so you don't end up creating yet another blue that nobody wants to maintain. And it also allows you to pick colors and all kind of wonderful things in there. The drop shadow editor is a visual drop shadow editor, so rather than you having to know the shortcuts and know exactly how it works, you can fiddle around with it until you like it. Then you go to the Changes tab, copy the CSS back over, and you're done. Other things that are currently in production in terms of visual tooling is CSS grid tooling. That's something that everybody asks us about because grid seems to be much more complex than anything else we've done before in CSS. Font tooling was another question as well. I'm not quite sure what to do with that yet. I want to see like performance, what your fonts are doing, how much of the font you're really using, if there are other fonts that are actually looking similar and are much smaller, performance mostly, but also like just seeing what fonts go well together. All kind of things are possible there. Service worker lifecycle visualization, knowing what your service worker lifecycle is like, has become quite daunting since we started with service workers. So we're thinking on putting something in the network pane that shows you the lifecycle of the service worker to make that much easier to understand. And if you have any other ideas, please tell us. We want visual tools in there. I think, as I said, I don't want developer tools to be expert tools. I want you to become an expert by using them. Emulation is something that I've been using for quite a while because it's really tough to use on your mobile phone, and to connect to your mobile phone is also not fun. It's the better way of doing it, but emulation is something that actually gets you there. So you can simulate different mobile devices. You can also simulate different networking states, like how does your application work offline, or how does it work when there's a really bad connection. And again, there's a ... menu, and in this one is a few things that I didn't know before either, like capture screenshot or capture full-size screenshot, add device pixel ratio, and so on and so forth. And interestingly enough, also a media query visualization. I've used media queries on my blog here like 8 years ago or something, and clicking those made me showed me that I should have optimized them a bit some time ago, but it made it much easier for me to understand where those kick in and what they do. There's also a screen ruler. That's something that I've been writing myself as a bookmarklet or an extension years ago that shows you like, does everything line up in pixel space? It's a wonderful way to actually see the design working. Interaction simulation, if you don't want to roll over or tap through your interface to see what the CSS looks like, you can actually in the styles editor, you can set a focus, active or hover state and see it that way. Or you can, again, right-click on the HTML element itself and force the state to these different states. And that way I can debug my CSS and see what it looks like without having to hover over it, because you spend far too much time hovering over it and finding it exciting. The rendering menu is something that is full of goodness, but it's actually quite daunting because the first time you open it, you get these like paint flashing, layout shift regions, FPS meter, all these real expert tools that make a lot of sense, but also sometimes like, what am I doing here? But the rendering has a lot of things in there that are useful for any user out there. One of them is, for example, simulation of print design. So instead of having to print a page or do the print preview in the browser, you can see what the print CSS looks like of your application. And that way it's much easier for you to debug it as well. Accessibility concerns are a big thing in anything that we do right now. One of the first things we actually did when we created the developer tools for Chromium in Edge, we made them keyboard and screen reader accessible. That's great for me as well because I love my keyboard and I love to tap through it much faster than just move my mouse around. And they also work in high contrast mode. High contrast mode is something that a lot of people forget. It's a visual aid for somebody with a visual deficiency to actually use an operating system. So it's a yellow on black background and very high contrast for people to see what's going on the screen. A lot of people need that, but a lot of developers don't even test for it because first of all, it's a Windows thing. And second of all, you have to turn on the emulation or you have to turn on the high contrast mode to see it. So you don't only see your product in high contrast mode, but also have to use your editor and your development environment in high contrast mode, which is pretty daunting if you don't need it. And one pro tip, Command-Shift-P gives you a command palette in the developer tools. So you can type all the commands that you want to actually have instead of having to find them in the whole interface. So in this case, I can type dark and then switch to dark theme by hitting enter. And I can type Command-Shift-P again, type light and switch to light mode again that way. Because light mode and dark mode is another thing in the rendering view. That's something that has been coming around for like a year now or something, I guess. And everybody now needs a dark mode for their app or a dark mode for their blog, or it's not the right thing. And again, it's super annoying to have to change your operating system and then see your editor in dark or light mode just to debug it there. So in this case, you simulate just the view of the website right now in color scheme light or color scheme dark without having to change your operating system. The same applies to prefers reduced motion. So if somebody gets confused by animation on a website or even gets seizures from it, they turn off animation. That's a new feature of almost every operating system right now. So that's a great way for you to test. If your animation is still run when that is turned on, you're doing something very wrong. At the same time, you don't have to change your operating system to do reduced motion. You can just do it in the browser for yourself. Another thing that was created by Matthias Beinens at Google last month, and we worked on that together as well, is like a visual simulation for different color blindness and also blurred vision. So again, you can just test your applications quickly, how somebody with a different deficiency would see your website, and also if while it's blurred, if still the most important things are very easy to find. Other things in production we have is a high contrast simulation. We want simpler accessible interfaces. I love that all these things are in the rendering tool or in the keyboard shortcut, but I would love them to be where you expect them. And we're doing a lot of research right now to see who's expecting them where. I think in the emulation pane it would be fun to put them in there, but we're going from there. Accessibility error reporting in context. So maybe in the source view that something gets flagged up in red that is an accessibility issue. And we have dual screen emulation because dual screen devices are the next cool thing. This is what high contrast simulation looks like. It's not out yet, it's coming. So this is just an internal preview that we have right now. So this is Wikipedia, and if I go to the rendering menu and I turn it into high contrast, I see what Wikipedia would look like in high contrast. And then I can use the style editing or anything to mess around with things and find out things where I forgot that in dark mode, it's in high contrast mode, it is not working, and so on and so forth. So a big thing that people keep asking me is speed, like browsers take too much memory, browsers are slow, what's the thing going on there? Now, if your operating system, if something goes slow, you actually open the activity monitor or the task manager and you look who the culprit is, like what needs the most memory, what needs the most CPU, and so on and so forth. Browsers have a task manager as well. It's in the browser ... menu, not the developer tools menu. And if you select the browser task manager there, you see the different threads of the browser itself, but also all the extensions and all the tabs that you have open. And you can see where your memory went and what's going on. So if you have an extension that doesn't do much, but has a massive network footprint, there might be something in the background that you don't know about. So take a look at that. That might be a dangerous thing. Firefox has that as well. It doesn't have an extra window. It actually has it built into the browser. So you can do about performance, and then you actually see all the tabs that you have open and the extensions, what's going on there. Now, how do we define these things? How do, once we know what people want, how do we actually build them? We have a thing called explainers. That's a thing that is actually used in the whole Chromium project by all companies involved. And we're actually defining in those what we're working on and what's going on. So in this case, the dev tools have the 3D view in there, the CSS grid tooling. So if you want to know what's coming, you can actually look into those. And internally, these are actually documents where all the stakeholders from different companies in the Chromium project are looking at those ideas and then giving feedback and seeing if it's useful. So we say, like, here's the user stories. This is what helps the end user doing that thing. That's why developers want it. Here's the accessibility story of it. Here's the performance story of it, and so on and so forth. So it's an open communication, and the explainers are available for you for feedback on GitHub as well. Others join as well, like Safari, for example, or the WebKit team has some two explainers out there as well. And I find that super exciting because it's great to see them playing in the open like that as well. And the last thing I want to cover right now, before I say a few things that make me happy, is the question that I always get, like, what are developer tools made of? Like, I don't know C++, I don't know Java, I would love to contribute, but I can't. Yes, you can. It's not Java, it's not C++, it's also not Flash, it's not Silverlight. It's actually HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you open the developer tools in the browser and you go to the menu that says the dock side to make it full screen. So this one docks it to an own window. So this one creates the developer tools now in full screen. And then you press Command-Shift-I or F12 again, and you open the developer tools for the developer tools. So you're debugging a developer tool interface with another instance of the developer tools. So it's turtles all the way down. I changed them to light here so you see the difference between the two. And if you start now inspecting, you can see how we've written the developer tools and how they're actually maintained. You see a lot of area going on in there. You see a lot of things going on. And all of these things have explanations why they are there. Looks daunting at first, but it's a very exciting way to actually start playing with it and find out why some things don't work in developer tools that you want to work in a certain way. If you find something to complain about, you can make me happy by giving me more work, and that's basically by clicking that icon. That one is that man with the speech bubble. That gives you an interface that takes a screenshot of the current website, puts the URL already in there, asks you if you want to share like more stack trace and telemetry, like what happened, so we can actually find out more what's going on, and asks you to describe the problem that you have or the feature that you want. If you put an email in there, we can answer and ask some more questions. That would be great. We have a dedicated team to actually understand like 12 different languages and answer in 12 different languages as well, in case you feel daunted by like doing an explanation in English or French or German. I can do those three. But this is basically the way how to get any information to us in the fastest way possible, because that's part of our stand-up every day, and we triage these feedbacks 3 times a week and then get them to the right people and see what we do with them. So what makes me happy about all of that? Well, first of all, I like that it's becoming more organized. We're building things that people need, not people that we think people need. And I like that we use web technology to build developer tools. This makes them embeddable, so other software can actually use editors inside them. VS Code is an Electron shell with Monaco inside it. And also other online editors are great. I love CodePen, JSPin, Code Sandbox, and so on and so forth, because I don't need to install anything on my machine. I can go to a client, for example, and open the developer tools and show them what's going on. Or if I want to try out Sass, I don't need to install Sass on my machine. I actually just go to CodePen, says I need Sass, it does it for me, I can write my Sass and see what the thing is. Learn the language rather than learn the tooling around it. And I find that really exciting. And it's also super exciting to work in developer tools themselves, because you're in an environment that you control. You are knowing that you have a Chromium browser to work against, so there's no question if those web components work or not, they're just there. Little touches that go a long way is something that I found lately as well. This is in Visual Studio Code. If you write something but you don't call it or use it anywhere else, it actually gets slightly shaded. So this here is a event handler for inform stuff, and it's not called anywhere. But if I now set an event handler on the form of submit, out of a sudden that do form stuff becomes yellow as well. This is a great way to find unused code in, for example, old code spaces and something like that, and finding out that you initialized something but never used it. So it's an easy way to clean up just by having a little visual tool to say like, hey, what's going on? WebHint is another big thing that I'm using for everything right now. It's a testing environment that allows you to test for accessibility issues, performance problems, and so on. It's a website, but it's also an NPM module. So as an NPM module, you can integrate it with other tools. In my case, I integrated with Visual Studio Code. So I've got a problem pane telling me all the things that I've done wrong before I actually submit it to GitHub. And also, instead of having to go into the problem pane, you get these little squiggly lines under things in your code that if you roll over them, explains to you not only in the MDN reference what the thing is, like an A here, but also what the problem is. So it's a very slightly annoying thing that makes you become a better developer because you want to get rid of all the squigglies. Now, one thing I realized is that with the code pens and other things like that we're merging more and more tools. Like VS Code is not only a terminal, it's not only an editor, but also a terminal and a Git control flow. So in this case, I don't need to know about the terminal anymore or set it up perfectly. I can actually use the inbuilt terminal in Visual Studio Code or point to one of my terminals and use it in there. So I don't have to jump from one context to another just for debugging or for deploying my code. But as I said, what most people use DevTools for is actually looking at styles and fiddling around with them. We can't have that in Visual Studio Code yet, or can we? So what we've been working on for a year now, and that's been available for you for testing for quite a while, is actually DevTools for Code. This used to be Elements for Code. That was only the Elements tab inside Visual Studio Code. Now we're actually trying to put more and more things in there that make sense, that people demand us, and we re-architected it to be a bit more easier to maintain. So you don't need actually replicated functionality in both places. This is what that looks like. So in this case, you connect to an instance of Edge and you get a preview of the browser in Visual Studio Code. You can then interact with it and click, for example, on the CSS to go back to your file in your project and start messing around or start actually coding your things there. When you then actually save it and go back to the browser, you actually see that the Sass has been converted into CSS again and the changes have been applied. So it's a real browser, it's an interactive browser in Visual Studio Code and not just an image or something like that. So that way actually means you don't have to jump from one environment to another, but you can do your debugging directly in your editor. And that's the great thing, as most browsers are actually automatable by now and can run in the background without you having to do it by hand. And that's all we have time for. So I thank you very much. I hope there's Q&A, and please play with those things and make yourself a better developer just by finding out things and staying curious. So I thank you very much. You can read me at CodePoint on Twitter or at Edge DevTools. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that amazing talk, Chris. I'm sure everybody watching learned a whole load about DevTools. I'm looking forward to watching it back so I can pick up some of your tips. So when you were going through the DevTools and learning, teaching yourself about it, was there some things which you thought were missing or something which you wished was there or completely different?
Well, you're defining my job right now, so basically that's what I'm supposed to do every day. But I found a few things, and I said that in the talk, I think, if I remember correctly. I found a lot of the tools are there that are expert tools, that you need to be an expert to understand what they mean, even in the phrasing, like the visual deficit thing that I showed, for example. You need to know the names of the different color blindnesses to understand what they are. And to me is an extra that I want to remove. I want these to be more simpler, easier English, understandable, and not like just a kitchen sink of information and hopefully you know what these buttons mean. So a lot of there's a lot of cargo cult of like, that's the most effective way to do this. And when I see different users in user studies interact with them and they just discard them for being completely too complex from the very beginning. I also found a few things that when you get reports back, like when we did the accessibility of them, when we made them all keyboard accessible and screen reader accessible, we went through every single bit of those developer tools. And then we found a really weird thing that, for example, there's a Web SQL console in there, and people were wondering if we make it accessible or not. And Web SQL is a standard that has been deprecated 4 years ago. So there's no point of this thing still being in there, but nobody complained that it's in there because nobody found it. And when you look at the telemetry and seeing what people are using, there's a lot of abandoned things there that are quite cool. And that's what kind of was my inspiration for this talk, to show people, actually, if you go to the ... menu, there's more things.
Okay.
And have you found any particular sort of frustrations while working with DevTools?
The biggest frustration I find is that there's a lot of I wished it would be like the other thing that I'm using. We, for example, we added just keyboard shortcuts for everything, and then everybody's like, why are the Vim keyboard shortcuts not in developer tools? Why is this not like Xcode? Why is it not like Visual Studio? So a lot of it is like comparison things, and a lot of it is not necessarily feedback, but just opinions. This should be like that because that's how I like it. And while people have all rights to their ideas, these are the loud people that actually overshadow a lot of good conversations that you could have. So I don't think there's not enough people standing up saying I'm confused. What is this thing doing? And there's no shame in being confused. There's no problem if not finding something. But a lot of my frustrations are mostly because everybody wants new things in there all the time. There's this CSS that is just a day old. Why isn't there no tool for that in there? And we're we haven't even made that a standard yet. We don't know if it's going to be a thing, and we cannot take it out. And at the same time, a lot of the things that are great in there are not used by people. So I want these tools to make you an expert, not to be an expert to use them. And that's something that frustrates me, that a lot of these tools make me feel stupid and make me feel overwhelm me and make me feel like I'm not part of this cool crew that uses these extra tools kind of thing. And these should be for everybody, not just for a small amount of loud people that demand things all the time.
So is that simplification of the language around developer tools the thing that the team are focusing on the most at the moment? Or are you working on putting some other exciting future things into developer tools for us?
I think the biggest things we worked on and we finally got out is the accessibility of the thing itself, that it all works in high contrast mode, that it all works in different languages as well. It's translated into 12 languages now, and nobody ever thought of that there's lots of great Chinese and Japanese developers that don't give you any feedback because they don't understand what your tools are and don't use them because they don't understand the complex language of them. We also were looking into more of visual tooling, like grid tooling is coming to the CSS grid debugging, and Flexbox debugging is coming to the dev tools. And I'm working on the high contrast simulation that I showed. That's something that I want to have in there as soon as possible, because not too many people test for high contrast because they don't know about it, because they never used it. And that would make it much easier for you to do. And the other thing that I'm concentrating on is the interaction with Visual Studio Code and the developer tools, and making the developer tools something embeddable in something else and not only a part of the browser, so that end-to-end communication of taking the developer tools into the Visual Studio editor, editing something and going back to the browser, something that I found everything is automatable the way we do it right now.
That sounds really exciting. I mean, if we had that and Vim shortcuts, we'd be golden, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, having a terminal in VS Code is something that I found amazing as well. I mean, if you take a look at the videos of my colleagues from Build, she's running the whole thing in Visual Studio Code itself. She's not jumping between terminal, browser, and Visual Studio. It just is embedded into the system by now. And that's something that it doesn't cost you a lot of time to jump from one to the other, but your brain realizes that something has changed, and that slows you down. And I think we don't do enough user testing and psychological user testing on developer tools as well. We do it a lot with things like WhatsApp or chat clients or these kind of things, mostly to keep people engaged. But with developer tools, it's much harder to do this kind of testing. And it was much easier before the whole COVID situation, because we could get people into the office and do in-person interviews right now. But now everything, you lose a lot of nuances if you don't interview people directly. If you do it over a video, you just don't get their confusion or their frustration at times. And that's something we work hard to work against. We don't want you to be frustrated by tools. We want them to be things that make it better.
Are there any tips that you can share from your own dev setup with regards to that kind of cutting out of jumping around, or even just any things that you particularly like about your own setup?
I love that I put webhint into my Visual Studio Code that basically tells me that I'm doing things wrong before I put them on GitHub, and then people complaining about them. That it's kind of frustrating the first two or 3 days when you're like, yeah, I don't care about Internet Explorer compatibility or something, but it makes you better after a while, because you realize you made mistakes that you copied and pasted for years and years that are a problem nowadays, and that one just flags it up for you and says like, don't do that again. So you actually start becoming more efficient that way. In other ways, I mean, I'm jumping between Mac and Windows all the time as well. So having the Ubuntu shell on Windows made my life so much better, because jumping from a Unix environment to PowerShell was never a fun thing for me. But now that the browser is available on all platforms, I don't have to jump between browsers much any longer. So, I mean, although I'm still using Firefox a lot as my browser on Mac, but it's fun to see how these things go. And I love that the Chromium project has so many players in it. I mean, there's the Samsung people in there, there's Google in there, there's Intel in there. So everything that we bring back into developer tools, and we try to upstream everything into the Chromium core, can go into any of these other browsers as well. So all the features are not only for Edge, but actually will be available for the other browsers if they choose to embed them as well.
That makes me think of Playwright, which is a really cool new project that Microsoft just open sourced as well, which is sort of like Puppeteer, but it's cross-browser, and they've submitted patches for Safari and Firefox. So you get a nice new automation platform that's cross-browser, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, I just started playing with Puppeteer and also Playwright last week after having to debug some things in the developer tools for it. And yeah, it's incredible, because it downloads the WebKit, it downloads Firefox, it downloads the headless Chromium for you, and then you can simulate an iPhone on in a CI environment, and that's pretty amazing. And I found it also cleaner and simpler to read, but that's of course second thing. Like Puppeteer did all the things, and once you build something like that, you cannot change it much. But if you're a new project that does similar things, you're allowed to actually change the API and the interaction models and appear much better that way.
Yeah, it's a lot of the same team, from what I understand, that had switched from Puppeteer to Playwright. So they're definitely, it's sort of like a 2.0 kind of rethink of things, which is always nice to do. So
yeah,
cool.
I just made the mistake earlier of npm installing it in a Dropbox folder. Never do that. If you want your machine to really slow, that's a really bad
idea. Dropbox rf minus rf star is the way to go, Chris. That's like a perfect development environment. All right. I think we're out of time. Thanks so much, Chris. Amazing talk as always, and thanks for sharing. And we'll see you in the chat.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Keep in touch, people. Thanks.